Address by Senator Thomas Eagleton, Democrat of Missouri, the second speaker this school year in the distinguished series of Landon Lectures on public issues. He has just returned from a fact-finding mission to the Middle East and will be discussing that in his address. To the stage now, and KSU President Dr. Dwayne Auker.
We welcome you to another of the distinguished Landon Lecture series. My name is Dwayne Auker, and I would like to first introduce to you, in addition to Senator Eagleton, those on the platform. On your right, Chris Badger, the student body president at Kansas State. Mr. Bob Wilson, who is chairman of the Landon Patrons. On your left, Dr. Barry Flinchbaugh, who is chairman of the series. And our favorite wildcat, Governor Alf Landon. And now to the speaker and the topic, 1977, Year of Opportunity in the Middle East. Senator Eagleton from the state of Missouri, U.S. Senator Thomas F. Eagleton, who was born in St. Louis, Missouri, graduated from Amherst College and from Harvard Law School, in both cases cum laude, honorary degrees from a number of universities, served in the United States Navy, and since 1956 has held a number of important positions in public life. Senator Eagleton has also written widely, several journal articles in the Missouri Law Review, Senior Power Magazine, St. Louis University Law Review, Foreign Powers. Senator Eagleton served as Circuit Attorney in St. Louis, Attorney General of the State of Missouri, elected in 1960, Lieutenant Governor of Missouri, elected in 1964, and has served from 1968 as United States Senator from Missouri. I present to you on the topic 1977, Year of Opportunity in the Middle East, Senator Tom Eagleton.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Governor. Thank you very much, Dr. Auker, for your fine introduction, and my thanks to the student body, faculty, and interested friends of Kansas State University for their invitation to be one of the Landon Lecture speakers in this scholastic academic year. Governor Landon, I would say this of you if you were not here with us today, and I know that everyone in this audience feels the same, that you are one of the great public figures of this era. I think politicians at times are like good whiskey. They sometimes improve with age. And the respect for Alf Landon of Kansas grows and grows each year. Indeed, as it does with the patron hero of my state of Missouri, President Truman. I found it interesting in this recent campaign that our country has just gone through that both candidates, both the incumbent President of the United States and the challenger, tried to identify themselves as often as they could with Harry Truman. And so it is that politicians want to identify themselves with Alf Landon as a person of capacity, depth of character, strength, etc. So I'm honored, sir, to be here with you and to participate in this lecture series. If I may, I'll proceed with my monologue lecture on what I consider to be one of the most important topics of our time, to wit, peace in the Mideast, and can we ever attain it? How do we go about achieving it? And then, as I think the custom is, we'll go to the Q&A session. That part I like the most. I sometimes know what I'm going to say in my speeches, but I don't always know what questions you're going to ask, and don't always know what answers I may give to them. So be thinking, if you will, of questions you wish to propound, and do not be necessarily confined by the subject of this speech. Be pleased to have you inquire further on the topic, but anything that is of interest to you as we begin a new Congress and a new presidential administration starting January the 20th in Washington. But today, for the moment at least, I will address myself to the topic that's been announced, 1977 Year of Opportunity in the Middle East. I think we could all agree that peace is civilized man's most elusive quest. It is, in a sense, a matter of time, circumstance, strategy, and events. The convergence of these elements can make brilliant strategists out of merely competent diplomats and great statesmen out of good politicians. These elements come together but rarely, and when they do, we must move decisively. Henry Cabot Lodge's new book, has just been on the market a few weeks, indicates that we failed to do so and thereby missed a good chance for peace in Vietnam in 1966. He was our ambassador and representative there at that time. Similarly, diplomatic pundits believe that we missed a golden opportunity for a very favorable Mideast settlement in 1969 and 1970. To me, it appears that 1977 may be a most propitious time, perhaps the most propitious time we will ever see again, for beginning the process of an overall Mideast settlement. While I recognize that speculation in itself can sometimes distort the picture, I would venture that the constellation of forces in the Middle East is nearing alignment. And I submit for your consideration 10 points in support of that assessment. And I'd like to go through them one by one. Point one, the underlying strategic situation is highly favorable to Israel. Israel's armed forces are in excellent shape, and Egypt and Syria would need as much as 2 years to catch up militarily. Israel, in other words, is in a position where it can afford to bargain. Two, Syria has more than its hands full in its de facto occupation of Lebanon, where its main function will be to keep the Palestinian Liberation Organization under wraps. Point three, Syria and Israel have achieved a pragmatic accommodation with respect to southern Lebanon. Israel would fear a concentration of Syrian troops on the border between southern Lebanon and Israel, and Syria has apparently agreed not to concentrate large numbers of troops in this area. Now, having already achieved a partial accommodation with Egypt in the Sinai, and now apparently with Syria in Lebanon, Israel has made a significant stride towards peace. Four, the Russian influence has declined perceptibly in the Mideast, enormously in Egypt, substantially in Syria. Five, President Sadat of Egypt and King Khalid of Saudi Arabia, King Hussein of Jordan, and President Assad of Syria are now publicly reconciled to the concept of an independent, sovereign state of Israel. Six, the more extremist Arab states, two classic examples of that being Libya and Iraq, are for the moment isolated from the Arab mainstream. Seven, the PLO, although not by any means in shambles, has been severely constrained, however, by the events in Lebanon. These same leaders that I just mentioned, Sadat, Khalid, Hussein, and Assad, they are determined that never again will they let events and policies in their region be dominated by the PLO. If there's to be any domination, in quotes, it will be them over the PLO, not vice versa. 8, both Egypt and Syria recognize that the economic strains in their own countries and the need for modernization of their countries, that these are more compelling and more urgent than continuing the bloodletting with Israel. To Egypt and to Syria, the United States is the key, both in terms of arms and industrial technology, and in terms of the special and unique role that the United States plans with respect to Israel. 9, Israel still refuses to deal directly with the PLO, but does acknowledge that at a Geneva conference, Palestinians will be present in some form, not necessarily under the auspices of the PLO. And 10, just this Monday of this week, Israel, for the very first time, introduced its own resolution in the United Nations General Assembly calling for the reconvening of the Geneva peace talks. Now, if I may, let me elaborate just a bit on some of these 10 points. Time constraints will not permit me to elaborate on all 10, but let me pick a few that I think might bear further expansion. As we know, there is great diversity in the Arab world. That world spans 2 continents, goes all the way from Mauritania in West Africa to Syria in the east and to Sudan in the south. The Arab language is in common, though dialects make communication sometimes difficult. Islam is the predominant religion, but there are various sects and other religions, including, of course, Judaism, Catholicism, Eastern Orthodox, etc. And there is a multiplicity of cultural backgrounds. Thus, international unity in the Arab world, while long a dream of many Arab leaders, has never, in fact, been a reality in terms of culture, and not necessarily for a long period of time has it been a reality in terms of geopolitical pragmatics. The last time that there was a general Arab consensus, that time was in the Riyadh Conference of 1974, because I'll later mention the Riyadh Conference of just a few weeks ago. I'll try to emphasize the B in Rabat, and however else you spell Riyadh, so as we can keep them straight. But at Rabat, in Morocco, in 74, there was an Arab Summit Conference, and they did achieve a consensus. They agreed at that conference that the Palestinian Liberation Organization would be given the right to bargain over territory held by Israel on the west bank of the Jordan River, land which prior to 1967 was Jordanian land, and thus under the jurisdiction of that country and King Hussein. But the consensus spirit of Rabat was dissipated by the bloody civil war in Lebanon, which is in sort of a neutral holding pattern at the present time. And with that war came about the sort of mind-boggling, almost incomprehensible alliance of Muslim Syria with the Lebanese Christians. That was the alliance. Assad, Syria, Lebanese Christians on the one hand against the PLO and the Lebanese Muslims on the other. After this war had droned on with incredible bloodletting, over 40,000 killed, almost the equivalent amount that we lost in terms of our own armed forces in Southeast Asia over a period of years from 1964 or 5 to its termination date in 74. We lost, I think, 56,000 in Vietnam. Over 40,000, perhaps now closer to 45,000, has been killed in Lebanon in a much shorter period of time in that tiny, small nation of the Middle East. As it droned on, Saudi Arabia, which is the financier and the bankroller of the Arab movement and of the Mideast, began to use its considerable influence in both Cairo and in Damascus to bring about some kind of an accommodation. And finally, on October the 18th, not quite 2 months ago, representatives of the key powers, both financial and militarily, in the Middle East, which included Egypt and Syria and Kuwait and included the PLO itself, they met in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia and agreed on a plan to stop that Lebanese war. The first step in the plan was perhaps as significant as the plan itself, because President Assad of Syria, who had been in an open and public feud with Sadat of Egypt, Assad finally agreed that he would no longer criticize Egypt's president, Sadat, for his signing of the Sinai Agreement. And in addition to patching up these personal and political differences with Sadat, President Assad acquiesced in the Sinai Accord, and in doing so may have signaled the beginning of the end of an era of armed confrontation with Israel. In acquiescing in the principle and adopted or embodied in the Sinai Accord, Assad seemed also to be signaling a willingness to bargain on the question of peace with Israel. In exchange for this very major concession, Syria was given the right to occupy most of Lebanon as part of an Arab League peacekeeping mission. It has the name Arab League. It's considered a multi-force presence in Lebanon, but at 95% is a Syrian army. The conflict in Lebanon had threatened the security of adjacent Syria, and the right to impose a peace in Lebanon, therefore, represented a major victory for Assad and for Syria, even though the Egyptians were also to be a relatively minor part of this peacekeeping mission. The Riyadh Agreement, this one on October the 18th, represents, in my opinion, a major breakthrough. Its significance is that, as of now, it stopped the fighting in Lebanon and brought much of the Arab world back together. No sooner had peace come in Lebanon, and it's still a fragile situation, but at least it's quieted down. No sooner had this taken place after the October conference, the reports were heard that Israel had augmented its forces on the Lebanon border. Would the PLO reoccupy southern Lebanon, was asked, or would Syria take up a position in that strategic area, thereby extending its front line, as it were, facing on Israel at the Lebanese-Israeli border? As it developed, the answers to these questions provide another hope that a settlement may be possible. With the United States as the goodwill intermediary, Syria agreed not to move its forces south of the Litani River, and it stopped the PLO from moving back to its southern refugee camps where it could launch attacks on Israel. Israel immediately then pulled back its forces, and a de facto buffer zone was created in southern Lebanon. Yet another very significant development for the cause of Mideast peace is the new status of the PLO. The PLO, as I said earlier, is not necessarily in shambles, but it has been severely constrained by events in Lebanon. Assad, Sadat, Khalid, Hussein, etc., all seem determined to never again allow the PLO to, as it were, dictate the bottom line of Arab politics. Israel, for its part, has been advancing a resolution at the UN General Assembly, as I said, introduced just this Monday, calling for a reconvening of the Geneva talks, and has recommended a new type of interim approach, patterned, as they call it, after the so-called Helsinki Accord. In an interview with the French newspaper François, Prime Minister Rabin suggested a number of arrangements with his neighbors which would be designed to demonstrate that cooperation is better than confrontation. Quoting Rabin, "I think it is better sometimes to begin by launching common economic projects and, thanks to the benefits derived, create an atmosphere that would help accelerate the movement towards peace." On he went in this interesting interview. And finally, in coming near to the end, we must consider the equal importance that a shift in Arab attitude towards the PLO would signal. Despite the rhetoric over this issue in the UN, the Arab countries are now much less willing to go to the mat to assure that the PLO is represented at a peace conference. And Israel has indicated that it will not object if a few Palestinian representatives are absorbed into the Arab delegations. Either the Jordanian delegation or the Egyptian or the Syrian are absorbed into all three of them and blended in rather than having a separate negotiating identity. It may well be that the easiest part will be the convening of the peace conference, calling it together. Even the broad outlines of a final settlement, one has to caution in all candor. The final outlines are still political dynamite, of course, for the countries involved. And bear in mind, parenthetically, that Israel is having its parliamentary or Knesset elections later on this year in the fall. Some big questions have still remained. Where would a Palestinian state be established? What about Jerusalem? How does Israel define, quote, secure borders? Each of these questions and others could present the negotiators with a loaded gun to be used to bring a peace conference to an inauspicious end. A final solution to the problems in the Middle East is by no means assured in 1977. But I remain somewhat optimistic, and I maintain my view that this year offers us the best chance for peace in the Mideast in a long while. Indeed, The current lineup in the Middle East may well present the last best chance for our generation to bring about a peace to that war-plagued portion of the world, and maybe the last best opportunity to avoid a fifth Arab-Israeli war, bearing in mind the enormous escalation in the sophistication of weapons and the annihilation that a fifth war in that area would bring to all of the affected countries. Thank you very, very much for your attention. We'll now proceed to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Senator. I'm sure there will be questions. And Senator, I'll just let you field the questions directly.
Fine. Who's got a hand? It's hard to see a little in the lights.
Right of center.
Yes, sir. Wherever. Yes, sir.
Senator, would you care to speculate on what caused the remarkable shift in attitude on the part of Syria with respect to the Soviet Union? And corollary of that is Syrian accommodation with the Christians in Lebanon.
Excellent question. It doesn't lend itself to a very easy answer because it's a very perplexing development in world diplomacy. Syria found that as the power of the PLO continued to grow in Lebanon, where what started out as a sort of a neighborhood brush fire situation, it festered and festered, and the PLO was getting the upper hand. They came to the conclusion that a PLO-dominated Lebanon on their border constituted a threat to their independence and viability. They found that even though they'd participated in the creation of this movement called the PLO, that it was getting out of hand and was no longer under the kind of control that they thought it should be brought under. And thus they felt in their own self-protection that they had to move to dampen the influence of the PLO. Secondly, there's always been the notion of what's called Greater Syria. This goes back even to the post-World War I days, Lawrence of Arabia and what have you, where the notion of a Greater Syria included the present-day boundaries of Syria, some of the land that's encompassed in Jordan, which was then called Transjordan, and Lebanon. And President Assad, I've been over there in his office. The map that's on the wall is not the Rand McNally map that all of us read and look at the borders. It's the map that he seems to like, and on his map is this thing called Greater Syria. There's always been the notion that those two should be assimilated. That is, the Syrians always believed in that. Thirdly, the split with the Soviet Union came about over this very question. The Soviet Union still is of a mind that the Arab nation should give almost carte blanche assistance to the PLO. That's been their policy. And thus, when the Syrians split with the PLO and picked as their ally the Christian Lebanese, thus the ones that were the most under the influence of the United States because of ancestral ties and what have you, this rankled the Russians very greatly. Now, they have not cut off military supplies to Syria. They've reduced shipments, but they haven't cut them off totally from either new equipment or from spare parts. But the Syrian military machine is stretched now to a pretty good point in terms of this occupation of Lebanon. They are in no position to even think about a fifth Arab-Israeli war at this time. And finally, of course, the Egyptian military machine is very bereft, it having not received even spare parts from the Soviet Union for many months. Yes.